All the difficult, divergent paths that blazed through 2020 led to Election Day. Election Day was seen by many as a point where we could see the potential for real solutions lying ahead. Of course, there could never be certainty in things left in the hands of policymakers, but there was a measured optimism on the part of the people. In New York City, grassroots organization Unite NY organized a march to the polls. A relatively small but energetic group marched from downtown Brooklyn to Prospect Heights, chanting throughout the entire journey. At the halfway point and the end point of the march, various groups provided PPE, sanitizer, water, and food, everything from granola bars to empanadas. While such gestures were commonplace at marches held around New York City, November 3rd, 2020 just felt a little bit different. There was an intimacy and buoyancy present that would have been harder to spot in the more massive actions that took place earlier in the year. Everyone left with a sense of communal support and a reinvigorated hopefulness, all tempered by a smattering of anxiety.
My name is Jason Little. I'm a photographer from Harlem, New York. So the photo I took was taken the day of Election Day. I think it was Election Day. And for 2020 election, it was taken on a march from Barclays Center to where we ultimately ended up at the Brooklyn Museum. And it was basically a, sort of a voter registration, encouragement drive to encourage people to come out, support, of course, support your candidate. It's about just generally voting. But the people who I was with were out there to say, we're hopeful. We don't know what's going to happen with this election. There are no perfect candidates. The choices we have in front of us aren't ideal, but we have to make an effort. We have to participate in this process to remove one person that we think is highly problematic and then see what happens. I don't think that people were saying, Biden, he would be a perfect choice. It was just saying, we've got to try, we've got to try something else. And so there was, in that sense, there was a little bit of hope in people, that we could try to make change, even if it's incremental. And so that's why I think there was so much good energy in the march that day. And just a little sense of hope that people had that we could do, we could see a little bit of change and start from there. Because what had gone on the previous 4 years, people felt it was unbearable. People felt we can't have another 4 years of this. So I'm going to come out and vote for change. And after that, we'll see how that change goes.
When was the first time you started covering the Black Lives Matter protests?
It was the first night that there were protests held in New York after we all saw the George Floyd video. I went out that first night. I believe it was Union Square, and it just continued from that point.
And what got you interested in covering the protests?
Oh, at first it was just the interest in what the reaction was. I was interested in capturing the reaction to that moment that the whole world saw. I knew it was historical, but the reason I continued was because what I saw in the news and what I saw in person as far as what was going on in these protests weren't matching up. And I felt like it was, even though I was only one person, I felt some sort of responsibility for portraying things as they were actually happening and not allowing the media to control the narrative.
How long have you been covering the protests for?
From that day till today, I'm still out there whenever there's something going on, even if it's sort of not directly related to BLM. It's something that I'm still covering. I've continued the whole time. So 2 years now, specifically related to this. Before that, I was doing things, just random events as they would pop up. There was some stuff about climate change, and certainly during the 2016 election. I covered some things related to that, but compared to what's been going on for the past 2 years, it was sporadic. Over the past 2 years, it's been far more consistent, even though 2022 has seen a decline in frequency, but it's still more. It's more in people's consciousness than it was in 2016, even. So it's still happening.
Why do you think people are paying attention more now to this issue?
Well, when everybody saw the George Floyd protests, it sort of reignited this sense in people that, police brutality is a big problem. It never disappeared from the consciousness of a lot of people in America, but I think if you look at what maybe white America's reaction to it, sometimes they felt like, oh, Rodney King, it's easy to go back to Rodney King, but other people knew this has always been an issue. George Floyd brought that back to the consciousness of all America. Everybody saw this, everybody saw a man die on their screen. And that kept the police brutality issue in the front of the minds of everyone. And if you look at that on top of what was going on with lockdown and the pandemic, it was just, I think people were overwhelmed by it, and it sort of lit a fire under a lot of people to get up, to do something that they hadn't done before. And even if they wanted to, the pandemic offered them the opportunity to do it because everybody was on lockdown. People were at home. If this had happened in any time prior to that, I don't think we would have seen the same response, just in terms of the sheer number of people who came out to protest police brutality and in support of Black lives.
Why do you think people came out in such huge numbers despite the fear of COVID?
People came out despite the fear because I think they had a compulsion that they hadn't had before. There was an urgency to it, something that social media provided. Again, the whole world saw the same thing. Everybody saw it at the same time, or within a relatively short time of one another. And with so many people being in a situation where they were off of work or out of school, whatever the case may be, they had the opportunity to come out. As I said before, it's something that people may have wanted to do in the past, but didn't have the ability to do because of other commitments. But now everybody was home with, for lack of a better term, nothing else to do. So when they saw this, and everybody was sort of moved by it, they were overwhelmed by it, enraged by it, they said, okay, you know what? I have to do something. I have to get up. I have to go out, despite the fear, despite what's going on with this pandemic, which was still new and not well understood. There was a lot of paranoia about, I don't know what's going to happen to me if I get sick or whatever the case might be. But people felt so compelled by what they saw on their screen that they said, I have to push that aside and go out and show my support.
What's a story you're hoping to tell?
Well, with that photo in particular, it was just one of hopefulness. Of course, it wasn't a situation where we knew any answers. We couldn't say for sure what was going to happen, but I wanted to show that people were involved in the process. People were doing what they felt they needed to do to create change. And that's also the case really with any photo that I take in the context of a protest. I want to show, first of all, as accurate as possible of the narrative that's happening, because we don't always get to see that side of it. It's always turned into something a little skewed one direction or another when you watch it in the news. But in general, the idea is just to show in 10 frames, if you're on Instagram, to show what is going on in this particular situation. And to also to show that there's a thread that runs through all of these things, whether it was Black Lives Matter, whether it was the ICE protests, whether it was climate change. There is a common thread through all of this. And everybody who's involved with these issues on a daily basis are simply trying to do something to better their community, to better the world at large. And I think that's the bottom line in all of these photos. Well, it's important for somebody like me, a regular person, to tell the story because somebody like me is on the ground. I'm with these people every day. I have no alternate agenda, and I'm connected to these issues. Sometimes we would see news outlets come out, and they come out for 15, 20, 30 minutes, and then they leave. They got their story. They tell it however they want to tell it, and they're done with it. There didn't seem to be any investment for them, but for all of us, we're very much invested in this because it means something to our lives. So it's important for me as somebody who's capturing the images of these moments of these people, because it's really about the people, to tell the right story, to tell the proper story so that we do maintain control of the narrative. There's power in being able to tell your own story from your own perspective. In that first week, I would say it was amazing, specifically in Harlem. Certainly the protests carried over. They were all over the place. They were here in Brooklyn and, all through Manhattan. And it was always very, very well attended. It was lively. It was energetic. People were both angry and inspired to do something about that. I don't think that generally the anger was misdirected. It was anger that people wanted to use in a productive way. And I think that's what everybody did. And again, that's an important part of telling the narrative, because sometimes when you will watch the news, it would be turned into something else. You may have isolated incidents of, some trash cans being knocked over, but that was in no way the story that needed to be told. It didn't overwhelm. It didn't. It shouldn't have overshadowed what was actually happening, because there were far bigger issues than what the mainstream media would sometimes convey. And so that's why the narrative needs to remain with the people who are on the ground doing the work, who are showing up all the time. And there have to be people willing and able to tell those stories accurately.
What other protests and events have you been covering?
Well, after BLM, I guess it led into some movements for ICE, immigration issues. There were a lot of immigration issues. And more recently, it's been climate issues and excluded worker funds. So that's an issue that revolves around people who were left out of the COVID budgets and things like that were instated during lockdown. So street vendors and cleaners and people like that, many of whom come from immigrant communities and were overlooked. And there was a lot of fear behind that because they don't really know how to address it with their government, because there's a fear of what happens if they find out I'm not legal. So their status always comes up, and those communities really needed a lot of support. So I felt it was important to tell those stories so that everybody could do what they could to support them.
How do you feel like Black issues, police brutality, these issues that you first started covering, how do you feel like they intersect with other issues of human rights?
Well, the issue of Black Lives Matter, the issues that they brought out are simply human rights issues. So the intersection there is, makes perfect sense. This isn't a separate issue. And I think sometimes it got framed that way in the news. But if you support BLM, you're just saying, hey, this is a human rights issue. People should not be subjected to police brutality just because of how they look. You would say, I would say that about anybody else. If you're an immigrant, you shouldn't be subjected to brutality just because you don't speak the language or just because, you cross the border. These issues in my mind are not separate.
What do you hope to achieve as a photographer through these photos?
The main thing that I hope to achieve through my photos is to just remind people that stories matter. These stories are about people. So ultimately, people matter, right? Because I'm not showing this for any personal gain. I supported these issues because they affect real people. I don't need to know every single individual within the movement. I don't need to know everybody at the march. The fact is, somebody in that rally, that march, or whatever the case may be, has been affected by whatever the issue might be. And you look at something like climate change, everybody is or is going to be affected by climate change. And just because a certain issue doesn't affect you specifically doesn't mean that you can't support it. I may not be an immigrant. That doesn't mean I shouldn't support, immigrants. And that's one thing I wanted to show with BLM. Like, if you're not somebody who is regularly subjected to police brutality or whatever the case may be, doesn't mean that you can't support it. So when you look at one of my images, I want people to see that these are real people. These are people who are affected by whatever is going on. And this is something that, again, it's a human rights issue. You need to see these as real people. There are stories behind each person. Even if you don't know that story specifically, just know that somebody that you may be looking at is directly affected by police brutality or whatever the case may be. I have never given a lot of thought to things like my images being distributed. I'm very honored to have them in a book, but I just want people to see them and have a thought. Just even if for a second, have a thought about the people that they're seeing. If they show up in a textbook 20 years from now, that's great. But my goal for my photos will never change. I just want people to see them and be affected by what they're seeing.
Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're interested in learning more about the photographer, you can check out more of their images and stories on our website, scop.io, and buy our book on any major online retailer or your local bookstore. Tune in to our next episode. And don't forget to subscribe. See ya!